Gage here from Sharp. Today I'd like to show you how to sharpen your knife. Now this video is going to be geared towards the beginner sharpener. There may be some tidbits for you intermediate sharpeners in there as well, but if you're an experienced sharpener, this video will be knowledge that you already have. So if you're a beginner sharpener, where do you start? Well, we're going to start by talking about whetstones. In today's video, we're going to be using water stones from Japan. As the name implies, they use water as a lubricant. You may have come across oil stones in your research as well, which work just fine, but you have to pay for oil and it makes the knife super slippery and in our mind, a little bit dangerous to work with. Now, we are going to move through a progression of 3 whetstones today, assuming that your knife is quite dull. And if you're a beginner sharpener, chances are you haven't sharpened any of your knives before, so it's safe to assume that your knives are quite dull. Our coarse grit stone is going to range anywhere from 140 grit up to around 500 grit. The lower the number, the coarser the stone, and the faster it's going to remove material. So if we have a missing tip on our knife, maybe we have a little chip through the middle of the blade, the lower the grit stone that you can work with, the better. It's going to remove material faster and help us to reshape our edge with more efficiency. Now, coming off of these coarse grit stones, your knife should feel sharp, but it's not going to feel great. It's going to have a bit of a toothy, almost serrated edge to it, and it's not going to give us that cutting feel that we're looking for. And that means we're going to need to move through a progression of subsequently finer stones. Now, your medium grit stone is going to bridge the gap between the coarse grit stone that we started with and the fine grit stone that we're going to finish with. Typically, these stones will range in grit from around 800 up to around 2000. At our shop, we use our 1000 grit stone as our medium grit stone. We find that the 1000 is the most versatile of all the stones. So if you're just looking to pick up one stone, the 1000 grit should be what you pick up. With a little bit of extra hand pressure, you can actually reshape your edge. And towards the end of the process, you can lighten up on your hand pressure and actually get a relatively good polish off of a 1000 grit stone. Now, maybe you're looking for a stone just for general daily maintenance. That's where I would recommend a 2000 grit stone. It's fine enough that it's not going to remove a ton of material from your knife, but it's not so fine that you won't be able to sort of gently reshape or hone your edge back to life. Now, off of a 1000 grit stone, we should have a very, very sharp edge and one that we can shave our arm hairs with if we've stropped our knife with a piece of leather. We'll talk more about this later. The reason I bring this up is because it's not always necessary to go to the finer grit stone. And in fact, with a stainless steel knife, we personally find that the edge off of a 1000 grit stone and a little leather stropping is perfect. Now you're here to learn today, so if you do have a fine grit stone, there's no harm in trying it out and seeing what results you can get from it. But typically, when you're just chopping vegetables and doing general prep, a 1000 grit stone, like I said, will be more than sufficient. However, if you are doing more fine work like slicing raw fish, for instance, a fine grit stone is certainly going to make a difference and give you an edge that will perform better at such tasks. Okay, so once we come off of our medium grit stone, we'll head on to our fine grit stone. These are going to range in grit anywhere from around 2500 up to infinity. We've seen them as high as 60,000 grit, which in our mind for kitchen purposes is totally unnecessary. Like I said earlier, a fine grit stone is great for working with like raw fish and stuff like that, but for vegetables, not really necessary. What it will do though is give you a really nice, almost mirror polish depending on what grit you're using. Of course, the higher the grit, the shinier and more mirror-like your polish will be. Now, you've probably come across 2 different types of whetstones in your research made in Japan, those that are called splash and go and those that require soaking. In today's video, we're going to be using soaking stones, which means that we need to soak them in water for about 10 or 15 minutes before they're ready to use. When you put your stones into the water, you'll notice them bubbling up at you. This is totally normal and it's just the water replacing the air that's in your stone. It's very important to soak our stones properly because we need to develop what's called a slurry during the sharpening process. And if our stone is not soaked properly, the slurry will not develop properly. So how do you know if your stone is ready to use? Well, like we said, if your stone stops bubbling, that's a pretty good indication that it's ready to use. Likewise, if you put your stone on your stand and put water on it and it soaks right into the stone rather than pooling on top, that's a good indication that it needs a little extra soaking. Just throw it back in the water for another 5 or 10 minutes and it should be ready to go. Splash and goes, of course, as the name implies, just require that you splash water on them and they're ready to go. We do find, however, that splash and goes do benefit from a little bit of soaking as well. Not as long though, usually around 2 to 5 minutes. Make sure to check with the retailer that you purchased the stone with. Ask them whether it's a splash and go or a soaking stone. Chances are nothing terrible is going to happen here, but if you soak a stone that does not require it for a long time, you run the risk of it cracking and breaking and becoming unusable. The tools that we will require in addition to the whetstones that we're using are a stone holder or some other tool to get the stone up off the surface that we're working on and keep it from sliding around. This could be as simple as a bunch of damp towels that you place underneath your stone to keep it from sliding around. Next, we're going to need some fresh water. It's important that we don't mix the grits of stone together as we're sharpening, so some fresh water is going to help us avoid that. Next tool we're going to need is a flattening device. This is super important. Do not neglect flattening your stone. We'll talk about this more when we're actually sharpening. But in today's video, the tool we're going to be using is the primo version of a flattening tool, being the Atoma diamond plate. This guy's 140 grit, super coarse, and it's going to do a really good job of keeping our stone nice and flat and make really quick work of it. There are other options out there. For instance, the Naniwa truing stone is another budget-friendly option. It's very effective at maintaining a flat stone, but not great at fixing an already dished out stone. Of course, if you don't want to spend any money and you have some sandpaper lying around, you can put that down on a flat surface and scrub your stone over the sandpaper, and that will do a relatively good job. It's not going to last very long though. Your sandpaper will wear out very quickly. Next, of course, we're going to need a knife to sharpen. In today's video, we're going to be sharpening this beautiful Shigeki Tanaka Kurouchi Aogami No. 2 Gyuto 210 millimeters. If you have a choice of knife to sharpen for your first time, I recommend something that is in the medium length. Knives that are really long will be difficult to learn on, and knives that are very short will be difficult to learn on. You also want to pick a knife with a profile that's very flat. So knives with a big sweeping curve towards the tip can also be difficult to sharpen. However, if you are using a knife like that, we're going to give you some really cool tidbits towards the end of the video that will help you sharpen the tip or any knives that are super curvy. Before we start sharpening, it's important to do a general assessment of our knife. What we're looking for here are scratch marks that are pre-existing on our knife. This is going to be very confusing if we're just starting out, understanding what scratch marks were there before and what scratch marks we created. So understanding which ones were there before we start sharpening is important. We also want to make sure our knife is straight. So looking down the spine, looking down the tip, we want to make sure there's no bends or waves in our knife because these will present themselves as an inconsistent edge while we're sharpening. So understanding what issues we have on our knife before we start sharpening is very important. Last thing we're going to talk about is how to grip your knife. If you've been taught how to properly grip a knife using the pinch grip, we are basically going to be using this grip, but it will change ever so slightly. So rather than having our index finger down on the body of the blade here, we're going to actually move that finger up to the spine. Our thumb is going to move down to the heel of the knife, and our right wrist is going to keep everything locked in place. We're going to show you in a second here how to find your angle. So it's important to note at this point that the right arm is not doing anything other than moving the knife forward and backwards. There's no pressure coming from this hand. All the pressure is going to come from our left hand. And more specifically, I personally like to use my index and middle finger to apply pressure. We want to keep our fingers as close to the edge of the knife as possible. This is going to give us the best feel for how the knife and the stone are making contact and allow us to keep our angle nice and consistent. You do want to avoid running your fingers along the stone, of course, because that stone is going to be removing steel from our knife, and it will certainly remove skin from your fingers. You're going to end up with these big holes in your fingers, and there's going to be blood all over the place, which is not what we want. So without further ado, guys, let's get sharpening. I'm going to throw my 220 grit stone down, and then I'm going to show you how to find your angle. We've got our stone down. We know how to grip our knife. We know that our right wrist is going to stay locked in place once we found our angle and is simply moving the knife forward and backwards. Our left hand is going to apply the pressure as close to the edge of the knife as possible. To find your angle, there are many methods out there, and I'm sure you've come across many. The matchbook trick, where you lay a matchbook down on your stone and you lay the knife down on top of that. You could use the penny trick, where you stack two pennies next to each other. The one closest to the knife will have one penny, the one furthest away, 3 pennies. Again, laying the knife down on those 3 pennies will give you a rough idea of where your angle should be. I find that these methods are not perfect, so the way I like to show people how to find their angle is imagining that straight up and down on the stone is 90 degrees. We can halve that to get to 45. We can halve that again to get to 22.5. Now, This is when it's going to come into play what steel type you are sharpening. For instance, if you are sharpening just a run-of-the-mill Henkel's stainless steel, standard stainless steel knife, you're going to want to sharpen it around 22.5 degrees, anywhere between 20 and 25. This is because that steel is not going to hold an edge if we sharpen too flat to the stone, and that edge is going to roll over really, really quickly. Now, on the other side, if you are sharpening a carbon steel like this knife, that steel is nice and strong. It's going to hold an edge that's sharpened flatter to the stone, and that's going to actually give us a sharper feeling edge as well. So if we are able to, we want to sharpen a little bit flatter to the stone. If we know where 22.5 is, we can therefore assume that just a slight sort of tilt down is going to give us around 15 degrees. Keep in mind that the distance from the spine to the stone, if it changes by about 1 millimeter, that's going to be roughly like a 5 to 10 degree difference in your sharpening. So I don't want you to focus too much on the exact angle that you're sharpening with when you're just learning. Somewhere between here and somewhere between totally flat to the stone is going to work for our purposes. What's really important today is that you remain consistent with whatever angle it is that you choose. As your sharpening improves, you can start screwing around with different sharpening angles. Before we start sharpening, it's really important to make sure that our stone is flat. Whether your stone is brand new or whether you've used it before, chances are it's going to require a little bit of prep in this regard. So with our diamond plate, we're going to get a nice bit of water on our stone, and we're going to simply scrub the stone. Now you'll notice when I'm doing this, I'm using circular strokes. I'm going forward and backwards. I'm just trying to be as random as possible. I'll also spin my stone around and continue the process. And this, again, will help me be as random as possible, which is going to give me a nice flat stone. If you're having trouble understanding whether or not your stone is flat, you can draw some grid marks on your stone with a pencil. Where you see the grid removed after you flatten is your high spots, and you'll likely have some grid remaining in the middle of your stone here, which is your low spot. Once all those grid marks from your low spot are removed, chances are your stone is flat. Now before we finish here, we just want to round off our edges. Now, if we were able to shoot this video over a sink, we would certainly be doing so. Helps clear up some of the mess. Even better than what we're doing here, but not quite as good as a sink bridge, would be just working next to a sink. That way you have access to fresh water, and if you make a mess, it's easy to clean up. All right, so don't be nervous, guys. We're going to approach our stone, and we want to do so in a comfortable manner. So don't try to get the knife totally perpendicular to the stone. You'll notice that makes me have to sort of torque my body, which isn't comfortable and is going to lead to inconsistency. So the most natural way for your knife to contact the stone is going to be sort of at a 45-degree angle here. On these low grit stones, it's important to have a good amount of water when you start, and that's going to help us form that slurry really nicely. So we know how to approach the stone. We're going to put our knife in contact with that stone, remembering that our right wrist and arm are going to stay locked in place. Our left hand is going to apply pressure with our index and middle finger, and we're going to apply pressure down into the stone as we push the knife away from us, just like so. When you're first learning, it's a good idea to come right off of the stone to come back to your starting position. We're going to move our fingers down the length of our knife, and we're going to move our knife just ever so slightly so we make contact at a different point. And we're going to continue this process until we've moved all the way down the length of the knife. Coming back all the way to the heel. And there you go. We've completed what we at Sharp call a pass. Now, a pass obviously involves a number of strokes. In some other sharpening videos, you may have come across people who would like you to count every single stroke that you put in. We find that this is not necessary and actually will lead to poor results, because if you're counting and relying on your count, you're likely not feeling what's happening with the knife. And what's happening with the knife in terms of how it feels is more important than the amount of strokes you're putting in. Now, it is a good idea to have somewhat of an idea of how much work you've done on one side of the knife so you can sort of mirror that on the other side. And that's why we find counting passes to be easier than counting individual strokes. So after we make our first pass, let's check and see what we've got going on here with our knife. Now, it's important that we maintain our angle, obviously, and to check if you've been consistent with your angle, you can look at the edge of your knife. What you're looking for here is a nice crispy, clean, sharpening line. We should not see a fat edge in one part and a really skinny edge in another part. If we're seeing any scratches coming up the side of our blade, that's an indication that we're too flat to the stone. If you're seeing any little cloudy bits, that also means we're being a little bit inconsistent. Maybe you're finding that after just one pass, you've developed a very aggressive burr already, and when looking at the edge, it's almost non-existent. This is a good indication that you're sharpening too aggressively. Another really cool trick you can use if you're a beginner and you're having a tough time understanding how your knife and stone are making contact is you can use a Sharpie to color the edge of your knife in, and this will give you a really good idea of where steel is being removed from your knife. If you're noticing a spot on your knife that isn't making good contact to the stone, you can readjust at this point. So we're feeling good after our first pass. Our edge is looking nice, it's crispy clean, there's no fat spots, there's no skinny spots, there's no scratches coming up the side of the blade. So we can safely assume here that our angle is correct and we are being consistent. So now we're just going to keep putting in work here until we formed what's called a burr. I'll be back in a few minutes once I form that burr and I'll explain to you what it feels like. I'm back with a burr on my knife. Now, this can be very difficult to feel with your eyeballs, but I'm gonna do my best to explain to you what you're feeling for. We started out with a rounded edge like so. We've removed material from our knife and we've started to push steel over the opposite edge of the knife. So if we are sharpening this side of our knife, the burr will form on the opposite side, the side facing up at us. What you wanna do if you're right-handed is grab the knife with your right hand, and with your left thumb, using the meaty part here, you're going to gently sort of flick your thumb over the edge of the knife here. What we're feeling for is a scratchy lip of steel. When we feel the other side, it should feel totally smooth. If you're feeling no scratchy lip on this side, it should be quite obvious. It just means that you need to put in a little bit more work to get that burr formed. Now, you may be a little bit frustrated with how long this is taking, and there are steps that you can take to make yourself a little bit more efficient. So right now we've been pushing the knife away from us and removing it from the stone, coming back to the starting position every time we put in a stroke. Of course, this is not super efficient. So as you improve and get more comfortable with the motion, you can leave your knife in contact with the stone. It's important to note though, that while I'm pushing the knife away from myself, I'm applying pressure. And when I am leaving my knife in contact with the stone to return to the starting position, I'm releasing all pressure. This is because you run the risk of angling your knife too much into the stone and applying pressure down will cause the knife to dig into our stone, which of course is not good for the stone and not good for our knife. I'll show you real quick what that's going to look like. Cool, so you notice there I did sort of long strokes, moving my fingers down the length of the knife as I was going. Once I made it up to the tip, I worked all the way back down to the heel, and then I put in some nice long strokes. These for me are a good way to just sort of even out all of the work that we've just done on that pass that we just made. So you may be finding that your burr is forming really nicely in the middle of your knife here and quite nicely in towards the heel. However, most people when they're learning have a lot of difficulty getting a burr formed at the heel and a burr formed at the tip. And this has a lot to do with the curvature of your knife. Now, someone showed me this when I was first learning to sharpen knives, and it really opened my eyes to what was happening. So when we have our knife in contact with the stone here, and we slowly pull it back, imagining that we're moving our knife as we're sharpening for a pass, you'll notice I've changed nothing with regards to my angle, but the tip of my knife is not making contact with the stone at this point. Now, again, this is because the knife curves upwards like this. So what we want to do to combat that is to simply just lift the handle of our knife up a little bit, making sure that our tip makes contact with the stone. You probably remember me saying don't leave your finger in contact with the stone because you'll wear away your skin. This is the only point of the process that I would recommend you do that, because you'll be able to better feel how the knife and the stone are contacting together at the tip of the knife here. We also want to sort of utilize a bit of like a half moon, sort of like a stroke that sort of matches the profile of the knife here. So it's like I said, kind of use these like little half moon strokes. You'll notice I'm lifting the heel. You'll notice I'm lifting the handle up a little bit, and then as I come through, the handle's coming down. And again, just trying to match the shape of the stroke here. Similarly, when we're doing the heel of the knife, sometimes our heel is going to curve back up into us a little bit. And that's going to mean that we need to sort of sit our handle down a little bit more to get real in good contact with the stone there. So this is going to be really exaggerated, but we're kind of sitting the knife down like this a little bit. You don't want to do it this much because you will round off the heel of your knife, which is no good, but just to give you a sense of what I'm talking about. So I told you at the beginning of this video that no pressure is coming from our right hand, but a little tip for when you are doing the heel of your knife here is to actually use a little bit of pressure, but just with your thumb here. When you're sharpening your knife, changing the angle is not what you want to do, but applying a little bit of extra pressure in whatever sort of problem spot you have will make a difference. So if you're not finding yourself making good contact with the heel here, just apply a little bit of extra pressure with your thumb here at the heel, and that should help you get right in there at the heel. Much better. Before we flip the knife over to do the other side, it's very important that our burr is formed properly. If it's not formed properly, we're not going to form that apex or that new cutting edge when we flip over to do the other side. So what we're feeling for here is a consistent burr. It should feel consistent all the way from the tip to the heel. If there's any spots that are missing a burr, you want to get back on your stone, putting in nice long consistent strokes, not focusing on any one part of the knife too much until that burr forms. If we focus on one part of the knife too much, we run the risk of creating sort of like divots and affecting the profile of our knife. So it's important to try to work the knife as evenly as possible. Only when that burr feels perfect, consistent all the way from the tip all the way down to the heel, do we flip over to do the other side. Now I'm feeling very confident about where I am right now. My edge looks nice and crispy clean. It's very consistent in terms of its width all the way from tip to heel. My burr feels consistent all the way from tip to heel. So I'm gonna flip over and do the other side of my knife now. Our grip's gonna change a little bit at this point. So our knife is gonna flip over. Our thumb now is going to go on the spine of the knife. Our index finger is going to go on the heel. With our left hand, our thumb is going on the spine and our remaining fingers wrapping over top of the knife. Very important here is that rather than starting closest to us and applying pressure as we push the knife away, we're going to start furthest away from us and apply pressure as we pull it in toward ourselves. A good tidbit that one of my employees, Ben, gave me was that the spine should always lead your stroke. So when we're sharpening on this side, the spine is leading the stroke as we push away. Similarly, when we flip over to do the other side, the spine is leading the stroke as we apply pressure, pulling toward ourselves. Good amount of water on here. We want to keep our stone flat, so let's give ourselves a little flattening here before we continue on to the other side. I'm also going to spin my stone around. Typically, when we're sharpening with our right hand on the front side of our knife, we're going to cause more material to be removed from this side of the knife. So it's a good idea. I should have done this in the middle of sharpening that side, but it's never too late. Cool, let's put some strokes in on the back side of our knife now. Again, starting furthest away from ourselves. Angle should be exactly the same, hand pressure exactly the same, and we're, again, working down the whole length of the knife. When you start out, removing the knife completely from the stone, returning to the starting position. And then as you improve, just leaving the knife in contact with the stone. You'll probably notice that the burr is going to form much quicker on the back side than it did on the front side. And this is likely due to the fact that we've formed the burr over this way. And when we flip the knife over and start sharpening, that burr is very, very weak. It's just gonna kind of fold over really, really quick on us. So that's why it's important to have a rough idea of how much work you've done on the front side so you can kind of mirror that on the back. Again, leading back to our pass counting. Rather than counting each individual strokes, I've probably done around 3 to 5 passes on the front side. I'll probably do around 3 to 5 passes on the back side. This is also a perfect opportunity to talk about the slurry that I talked about at the beginning of the video. The slurry is a mixture of stone, water, and steel, forming this sort of abrasive paste on our stone. We don't want this to get too thick and dry up, but we also don't want to wash it away. So that's why it's a good idea to have like a little squeeze bottle of water that you can just sort of rehydrate your stone with a little bit as you go. Again, we always want to take our time with this and be checking our work as we go along. We're looking here, again, exactly for what we were looking at on the front side, which is a nice, clean, consistent edge. It shouldn't be super fat in one spot, super skinny in one spot. We shouldn't see scratches coming up the side of our knife, and we shouldn't see any cloudy bits anywhere. You'll probably notice that the edge on this backside is going to look very, very skinny at this point. That's totally normal. What we're trying to do if we're getting a 50-50 bevel on our knife is to try to match the width of the edge on both sides. So I've got a little bit more work to do here. My edge is very skinny on this side right now, so I'm going to put it in a couple more passes to sort of even things out. Now you may be frustrated that your burr is not forming, and I wish I could tell you how long it's going to take for this to form, like exactly how many passes, but it really depends on the condition of your knife. If your knife is super dull, this may take 5, 10, even 15 minutes, depending on the grit of stone you're using. If your knife is brand new, it may form in a matter of 1 or 2 passes. Now we can think of forming the burr on side A of our knife as step 1, flipping over, forming the burr on the backside as step 2, and only when our burr feels consistent on the backside of our knife, like it did on the front side, do we move on to step 3, which is going to be deburring, or removing that burr that we formed. So the burr, again, has formed this way, it's now over this way, and this loose piece of steel needs to be removed so that we can expose our new cutting edge. Now, I like to think of this as like when you take a pop can tab off of a pop can, folding it back and forth a bunch of times until it just breaks away. That's essentially what we're going to try to achieve here with our knife. And we're going to think of folding the pop can tab as putting in nice long strokes and switching sides every time we put in a stroke. It's very important that we don't switch sides before we get into the deburring phase. So, how does the deburring phase work? Well, we're going to start on the original side of our knife that we started on. We're going to place the tip of our knife on the stone here, and we're going to push the knife away from us this way, and we're going to try to get the heel of our knife to end up here. So that's going to look like this. We're going to stay right where we are. We're going to flip the knife over, and we're going to, again, start at the tip of the knife, and we're going to move the tip this way, and we want the heel of our knife to end up here. And we're just going to keep repeating that process over and over and over again. The first few strokes should be about the same hand pressure you were using when you were sharpening. As we go, we want to lighten up on our hand pressure to the point where we're only applying enough pressure to keep the knife in contact with the stone. Chances are you're going to need to do about 5 or 10 of these on each side to get the desired results. So I'll be back in a second. Here. Now you've probably noticed that every time I start a stroke, I'm starting at the tip and finishing at the heel. This is going to give me great contact at the heel of the knife, but chances are I probably won't have made great contact at the tip. Now to combat this issue, we're going to incorporate sort of like a 4-stroke pattern into our deburring. One where we start at the tip and finish at the heel on both sides, and then start at the heel and finish at the tip on both sides. It's going to look like this. All right, so before we move on, we need to do an assessment, make sure our knife is feeling good. To feel on your knife whether you've done a good job or not, we're going to feel both sides of our knife for our burr. Using the technique I showed you already, using the sort of meaty part of your thumb, you're gonna run your finger down the length of each side of the blade, making sure there's no scratchy bits showing right now. If there are, you just want to get back onto the stone, put in those nice long strokes, and lighten up on your hand pressure as much as you can until those burrs are gone. Now, this isn't for the faint of heart, but to get a really good test of the sharpness of your knife at this point, you can use 2 fingers to gently sort of run down the edge of your knife, and they should sort of cut into the first layer of your skin. Be very, very careful here, and if you don't feel comfortable doing this, don't feel it necessary, but I would say that this is a really, really important way to sort of feel the sharpness of your blade. Now, it's very important that our knife feels sharp at this point. No higher grit stone is going to make any difference here. If you move on to a higher grit stone before your knife feels sharp on your lower grit stones, you're going to end up with a shiny but very dull knife still. So if you're not feeling that your knife is sharp at this point, you can try putting in some longer deburring strokes again and see if that fixes your problem. If that's not working for you, unfortunately, you're going to have to go right back to step 1, which is forming the burr on side A, flipping over, forming the burr on side B, and putting in your deburring strokes. Let's assume that you've done a great job. This knife is feeling really good, so we're going to move on to our next grit, that being the 1000. All right, we've got our 1000 grit stone set up here, and you guys basically know how to sharpen a knife at this point. Everything that we do on this 1000 grit stone is going to be exactly the same as we did on our lower grit stone. The only exceptions being that we're going to use slightly less hand pressure, and the burr that you form is going to feel slightly less aggressive. This is exactly what we're going for as we're trying to refine the edge on our knife. So just to reiterate, we're going to start again on this side of our knife. Form the burr on side A before flipping over to form the burr on side B, and then deburr our knife. So let's get to it. This is that slurry I was talking about earlier there, guys. We see the nice, this nice sort of paste that's forming. This is really, really good. We don't want to get rid of that. So as the knife or as the stone kind of dries up a little bit, just a couple little dots on water there to keep her going. We're done on the 1K. Time to move on to our fine grit stone. All right, we're on our fine grit stone here. You probably noticed this guy looks a little different than the other 2 we were working with. This is a natural stone. You certainly don't need a natural stone. This is just what we had on hand for the video. So I'm going to repeat all the same 3 processes over again, and that will be the final stone that we use. At this point, nothing's going to change. We're still trying to form that burr. If you're not feeling the burr, you do kind of have to go through the motions a little bit here, putting in about 5 or 10 passes on each side of the knife, and that should be sufficient. We're all done on the stones now. At this point, our edge, again, should look very nice and crispy clean. It should be nice and shiny at this point off of our fine grit stone. We should feel no burrs at any point on our knife, and our knife should feel very, very sharp at this point. To get it even better though, we're gonna hit it on the leather strop. Basically, we're using the same strokes as our deburring strokes that we were using on our stone, but now we're doing them on our leather strop. Now you may be wondering what exactly this does, and I don't know the science behind it. All I know is that it makes your knife feel even more sharp. Basically what's happening is it's further refining the edge of your knife, removing any micro burrs that might be left over. Very similar to what barbers used to do when they would use a straight razor, just further hones the edge of your knife and makes it feel even sharper. So to test your knife's sharpness, there's many different methods. You could slice a tomato, you could cut a piece of paper, but in our mind, there's 3 tests that really tell you the most about the sharpness of your knife. Those being cutting into your fingernail. If you gently touch the edge to your fingernail, if it bites into your fingernail, your knife is sharp. If it skates across your fingernail, it doesn't bite into your nail, you haven't done a great job. Another test you can use is shaving your arm hair. If you can shave your arm hair, your knife is likely very sharp. The last test that you can try is setting up a V-shaped piece of paper on your station. And if you can push the knife into the paper without using any forward or backward motion, that's like the ultimate test of sharpness. It's important to note that you should test every part of your knife, the tip, the body, the heel of your knife, and make sure that all areas of your knife are sharp. I hope you enjoyed the video, guys. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns about your sharpening journey, leave a comment down below and we'll be happy to help you out. If you got some value out of this video, we would really appreciate it if you could hit that like button, subscribe to our channel for more knife-related content, and until the next video, stay sharp. Or I guess in this instance, get sharp.